The name Martin Bellamy, 54, had once been the pride of a small coastal town in Oregon, a place where people still believed that wealth equated to success and virtue. Martin wasn't just a businessman. He was the embodiment of achievement, the man with gleaming Swiss watches, Italian leather shoes, and a confident smile. So practiced, people joked he could sell sand in the desert. On that crisp autumn morning, the local courthouse was packed, not for some routine trial, but for the hearing of the man once hailed as the town's great father. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk squeezed shoulder to shoulder, breaths held taut like strings on a violin, every eye fixed on the door about to open. Then Martin walked in, tall, imposing, dressed in a sharply tailored navy suit. He strode in as if stepping onto a podium for an award, not into a courtroom as the accused. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his wristwatch caught the fluorescent lights, just so. He smiled, not the nervous grin of a man on trial, but the knowing smile of someone who believed everything would be taken care of. The murmurs in the courtroom buzzed like a beehive split open. He actually showed up. It's probably just a misunderstanding. There's no way Martin fooled the whole town, but it was his eyes, the complete absence of remorse in them, that silenced everyone. Then Judge Eleanor Price, 62, a black woman, entered the room. She didn't need to say much. Her presence was enough. With her silver hair neatly pinned up, piercing gaze, and calm demeanor, she was the embodiment of justice, one not swayed by glitter or power. All rise for Judge Eleanor Price. Everyone stood. Everyone, except Martin. He remained seated, casually flipping through documents like he was in a boardroom meeting. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Martin simply waved it off as if all of this were a minor inconvenience. Judge Eleanor paused, looking directly at him. Her face showed no expression, but the entire room felt frozen. Everyone held their breath. "You may be seated," she said, her voice low and firm. No one spoke another word, but everyone understood. Martin Bellamy had just made the first critical mistake in a life that once seemed untouchable, underestimating the weight of an unyielding judge. And that was only the beginning. For years, Martin Bellamy was the man everyone respected, or at least pretended to. He built the Bellamy & Sons real estate empire with sharp instincts, quick thinking, and a touch of clever rule-bending no one could quite pin down. Parent-teacher conference at school? He donated a new garden. Church roof needed repairs? He paid for it and even showed up to cut the ribbon at the dedication. Every festival season, there he was, smiling warmly in the newspaper, shaking hands with the mayor and major sponsors. He was the kind of man a small town like Newport didn't dare question, because everyone owed him something. And to Martin, trust was an asset, and kindness was a tool. There was only one person who didn't play by those rules, and ironically, it was the woman many assumed had been pushed to the sidelines, Judge Eleanor Price. Eleanor had gone to law school with Martin. Back then, he was the rising star, while she sat quietly in the back row taking notes, largely unnoticed, but she remembered. Every legal loophole Martin used in class debates, even his final thesis, where he boldly declared that understanding human weakness is the key to success in business. When she received the first complaint about Martin, about low-income housing contracts laced with binding clauses, about the tenants being evicted over minor paperwork errors, she didn't believe it right away. She investigated, reread every file, cross-checked every signature, and then she saw something that chilled her. Martin hadn't just learned to bend the law. He had mastered how to distort it for his own gain, convinced no one would dare to touch him. Eleanor began calling in everyone involved, families who'd lost their homes, elderly tenants tricked into signing long-term leases. Even the ex-wife Martin had once convinced to withdraw a shady asset complaint years ago. Each testimony was a fragment, and she patiently pieced them together, like assembling brittle bones from a long-buried skeleton. When she finally had enough to bring Martin to trial, she said just one thing to the court clerk: "I'm tired of watching justice drown in expensive cologne and pretty words." On the day of the trial, Martin still believed he could talk his way out. He believed Eleanor was just an arrogant old woman with a bruised ego. But he forgot one thing. Some people aren't looking for victory. They're looking for the truth. And once they start, they don't stop. And that, for the first time in years, was what truly scared him. There's something few people know about Eleanor Price. She almost left the law for good. Back then, fresh out of school, she took a job as a public defender in a big city, a place where truth didn't always win, and the wealthy rarely lost. One case nearly broke her. Her client, a single mother, had been evicted from her apartment in the dead of winter after failing to pay a sudden rent hike. The management company, a small branch of the Bellamy and Sons empire. Even after presenting evidence of discrepancies in the lease, of vague clauses the woman was never properly told about, Eleanor lost. Lost to a team of sleek, sharp-talking lawyers and the smug smiles exchanged outside the courtroom. After that hearing, she drafted her resignation. But before walking away, she spent one last night reading the entire case file, not to find a new way to win, but to understand where she had failed. And from that night on, she chose a different path, not one of grand speeches or popularity, but of deep, deliberate listening. She listened to the details others skipped over, to the fear trembling behind hesitant testimonies, and to the quiet rage in the eyes of those too poor to be heard. Years later, when she became a judge in Newport, a small town with quiet undercurrents, Eleanor kept her habit of personally reading case files every Friday night. She never fully trusted assistant summaries. She wanted to hear every word with her own eyes. So when the first complaints against Bellamy and Sons began to trickle in, small, scattered, not enough to raise alarm, Eleanor found them strangely familiar. The odd clauses, the inconsistent signatures, the recurring system errors. She began calling each plaintiff into her office one by one. They were surprised to find the judge herself asking questions, making tea, offering tissues when the tears came. But it was through those conversations that she started connecting the dots. Eleanor's motivation wasn't to get revenge on Martin Bellamy. It wasn't to teach him a lesson. It was because she knew if she didn't do something, no one else would. And the people being hurt would keep staying silent or be forced into silence. "I don't fight because I think I'll win," Eleanor wrote in her journal the night before the first hearing. "I fight because I can't sleep if I don't." And that was when everything truly began. No longer just scattered documents, but a full picture with Martin Bellamy at the very center. The first trial opened on a drizzly morning, and the Newport Town Courthouse was packed to the brim. Locals filled both sides of the room, some even standing in the hallway just to catch a word or two through the old wooden doors. Everyone wanted to witness the moment Martin Bellamy, the most powerful man in the region, took the defendant's seat. Martin entered the courtroom with his usual poise. Light gray suit, deep red tie, face calm as if everything was already decided. The press jostled for space, cameras flashing, expecting another easy win, just like always. But then Eleanor Price emerged from the judge's chambers in a plain black robe, her silver hair neatly tied back, her gaze steady and unshaken. She took her seat at the bench the way someone might sit down at their own kitchen table, calm without fanfare. The first case was brought by a widowed woman named Maria Jennings. She had lost her home after Bellamy and Sons abruptly raised the interest rate on a restructuring contract, one she had never fully understood. Eleanor had pored over that file for 3 straight nights. She knew this wasn't just one isolated story. Martin's lawyers began with a sharp, polished defense full of technical jargon and contract references. They argued that every plaintiff had voluntarily signed, that there was no evidence of coercion or wrongdoing. Eleanor listened in silence. When it was her turn, she asked just one simple question. "Do you remember April 14, 2012, Mr. Bellamy?" Martin frowned. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. Eleanor pulled out a legally verified recording, a conversation between Martin and one of his subordinates discussing how to clean up the books by exploiting legal loopholes in old contracts. The courtroom fell silent. "This is a test case," Eleanor said slowly, turning toward the audience in the room. "A single link in a much longer chain. And this court will not turn a blind eye to a system built to squeeze the vulnerable." Martin Bellamy didn't respond. In that moment, for the first time in years, he was no longer the one in control. The trial ended that same day, but its echoes carried farther than Eleanor had expected. The press ran story after story. More victims began to come forward, some with full case files, others with nothing more than a slip of paper listing the address of the home they'd lost. The pieces were starting to come together. and Eleanor knew. She had just opened the first door in a long fight, but at least the door was open. The door had opened, and old winds began to blow in. Since the first trial, the small courthouse where Eleanor worked had become busier than ever. People from nearby counties made their way to her, carrying thick stacks of confusing contracts, some bringing nothing but a tearful story and a fragile thread of hope. There was a tractor mechanic whose home was repossessed by the bank over a flexible loan with an interest rate that skyrocketed after 6 months. A widowed nurse sued for violating a contract clause she hadn't understood when she signed. All of them shared one thing in common. They had once believed Martin Bellamy and his company were helping them. Eleanor quietly listened to each person, taking detailed notes, asking short but pointed questions. She never rushed. She knew that turning the tide couldn't be done with emotion or fleeting outrage alone. She needed evidence, she needed structure, and she needed a team. That's when a young man named Alex Monroe showed up. Once a top law student, he had dropped out after his mother lost their home and they were forced to live in an RV. He knew all too well the tactics of Bellamy and Sons, and he volunteered to help Eleanor. In the old basement of the courthouse, once used only for storing records, they built a strategy room. The walls were covered with diagrams connecting lawsuits, names, contract dates, and recurring phrases in legal language. Every day, Eleanor and Alex worked like puzzle solvers, following breadcrumbs through hundreds of documents, from cleared-out neighborhoods to scribbled margin notes buried in contracts. During that time, the media began to change its tone. At first, they called Eleanor's lawsuit a sentimental gesture from an old woman, but after a series of investigative articles from the Newport Ledger, featuring direct excerpts from financial records and recordings provided by Eleanor, the public began to wake up. A wave of response followed. Civil rights groups, law students, even former bank employees who once worked under Bellamy came forward. Some admitted they'd been instructed to pressure clients into signing unclear contracts. Others sent handwritten letters thanking Eleanor, calling her the last light in a broken system. But just then, the darker side of the fight became clearer than ever. Eleanor began receiving anonymous calls. Once, she came home to find her gate pried open and several files disturbed. Nothing valuable was taken, but the message was unmistakable, and she knew. Bellamy had begun to strike back. That night, Eleanor sat quietly in the small kitchen, a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea in her hand. The soft yellow light reflected off her round-framed glasses, casting a gentle glow on a face marked by the passage of time, yet still shining with a clear, unwavering determination. She knew this path wasn't for the faint of heart, but she was not alone. The next morning, Alex arrived early, his face tense. In his hand was a copy of a special contract, one with Martin Bellamy's electronic signature. It was the contract he'd signed to transfer a public land parcel into personal property, then sold it to a third party at 4 times the price, later blaming it on a clerical error. "I found it in the public archive at Dyer County," Alex said, his voice both trembling and excited. "Eleanor, this could be the key." Eleanor smiled faintly. She didn't say a word, only silently reached for another thick stack of documents. She knew that once the hidden channels were pierced, what flowed out wouldn't just be dirty water, but a flood. At the same time, Bellamy was not sitting idly by. He hired a renowned team of lawyers from New York, issued a press release claiming that all accusations are baseless, and that people like Eleanor are simply trying to grasp at the final glimmer of fame. He also announced a $500,000 donation to a legal scholarship fund, a move that the press called a public image cleanup strategy. But Eleanor knew that the people were no longer so easily fooled. They had started to listen, started to read, and started to ask, why were so many people falling into the same trap? At a community meeting in East Hollow, a town that had once been rezoned by Bellamy and Sons, Eleanor stood up, microphone in hand, her warm voice filling the otherwise silent room. "No one of us is perfect, but when one person's mistakes cause hundreds of people to lose their homes, their hope, it's no longer a personal matter. It's a matter of justice." She didn't speak loudly, nor in anger, but each word was like a needle piercing through the glossy cloak of Bellamy. That day, the crowd clapped nonstop. An elderly man stepped forward, placing his frail hand on her shoulder. Thank you for standing up when no one else dared." That night, Eleanor opened a handwritten letter sent from a distant town. It was from a single mother named Marissa. In the letter, she wrote, "I never thought an elderly woman could shake the very foundation of a system. But now I believe, because of you, I can protect my daughter." Eleanor folded the letter and placed it on the top shelf of her bookcase. It wasn't evidence, nor was it the law, but for her, it was the reason big enough to keep going, and she knew the road ahead was still long. That morning, it was drizzling lightly. Drops of water tapped gently on the windows of Eleanor's office, where she was deeply focused on reviewing each line of documents. On the desk was a report sent by a former employee of Bellamy and Sons. The report was anonymous, but it was detailed enough to be hard to dismiss. It contained internal notes, email exchanges that clearly showed how Bellamy had instructed his legal team to pressure people into signing settlement agreements by using threats and false promises. One email even referred to the case of the elderly lady needs to be extinguished before it spreads. Eleanor sat still for a moment. The elderly lady? Perhaps they thought her age made her weak. But they had forgotten that time doesn't just wear things down, it also forges them. That afternoon, Eleanor met with Alex and the group of law students who were helping with the case. She placed the stack of documents on the table and said, in a steady voice, "We are not just facing a case of wrongdoing. We are up against a system cleverly designed to create legal accidents." Alex looked at her and nodded. "I'll send everything to the press, but Bellamy might sue for leaking internal information." Eleanor smiled lightly. "Let them sue. Justice doesn't come from silence." Not long after, the New Hampshire Ledger published a 5-page article titled, "Inside the Empire of Silence, The Shady Deals of Bellamy and Sons." The article was explosive and shared thousands of times on social media. On television, news programs began referring to the silver-haired woman from Ashbrook as a symbol of the new wave of demands for transparency. On Bellamy's side, the response came quickly, as usual. They held a press conference claiming all the documents are forged and suggested that Eleanor was being manipulated by forces trying to bring down Mr. Bellamy. But this time, public opinion was harder to sway. A group of former employees who had been silent for years began to speak up. They confirmed the threats, the legal loopholes, and the media manipulation. Eleanor wasn't seeking the spotlight. She still rode her bike to the grocery store every morning, still tended to the lavender flowers on her porch like any other day, but when she saw the framed print of the first article delivered to her home, there was something in her gaze, a quiet sense of reassurance. She knew a door had been opened, and this time, it wouldn't be easy for anyone to close it. The courtroom was packed that day, mostly with elderly people. They sat quietly, neatly, as if attending a solemn ceremony, not a civil trial. Outside the courthouse, the crowd continued to gather, even though the security guards had put up barriers. At 9 a.m., Eleanor walked in. Everyone stood up. Plaintiffs, defendants, even the reporters sitting at the back. Everyone, except one person. Martin Bellamy. The man in the light gray suit, his hands loosely folded in front of his stomach, his gaze distant as if admiring an invisible painting on the wall. No movement. No respect. Eleanor stood tall, her gaze landing on Martin's face for a single breath, short but enough to silence the entire room. She sat down, her voice clear, calm, and firm. "Mr. Martin Bellamy, I will assume you are unfamiliar with courtroom rules. If you do not stand when the court enters next time, I will treat it as an act of contempt. Do we understand each other?" Martin gave a slight smirk, unclear whether it was a smile or a sneer. "Understood, Your Honor." Eleanor didn't respond. She turned to open her file as if his words were no more than a scrap of paper. The trial began. The plaintiff presented the first piece of evidence, a copy of a deed with a forged signature. Eleanor listened, took notes, her gaze occasionally flicking toward Martin, who sat with his young legal team, but appeared to be the only one who did not regard Eleanor as an arbiter of justice. Rather, he seemed to see her as an enemy to be toppled. At lunchtime, Eleanor passed Martin in the hallway. No words were exchanged. But she could clearly feel his gaze, not fearful, not evasive, but as if he were challenging her. She didn't turn back to look. Throughout her career, Eleanor had faced criminals, murderers, and the most desperate people. But Martin Bellamy, he was a different kind. A man so arrogant he believed he could stand in the courtroom and not lower his head. She smiled. Not because she enjoyed it, but because she knew. The real fight had just begun. On the third morning of the trial, it rained lightly. People still stood in a long line outside the gate, umbrellas in hand, eyes fixed on the inside as if waiting for a climactic moment in the symphony of justice. Eleanor walked into the courtroom, and this time Martin stood up, but his gaze remained the same, cold and unyielding like a stone wall. The plaintiff's attorney, a silver-haired man named Roland, rose and spoke in a firm, steady voice. "Your Honor, we have gathered new evidence of the systematic misconduct by Bellamy and Sons. May we present it?" Eleanor nodded. On the large screen in the center of the courtroom, a file was projected. The first piece of evidence, the deed of property transfer from Mrs. Evelyn Harper, one of the elderly people who lost her home. The signature on this contract, according to the forensic analysis, did not match any previous signatures from Mrs. Harper. Roland looked up and said briefly, "Forgery." The room murmured. Eleanor raised her hand and the room fell silent. The next piece of evidence, a bank statement showing that the compensation payment from Bellamy and Sons had not been transferred to the citizens' accounts as required, but had been funneled through a company named Dover and Flint, based on an island off the coast. According to the tax records, this company had no actual operations. "A shell company," Roland said, without raising his voice. Then came the final detail, the piece no one expected, an anonymous email sent to Roland's office just 3 days before the trial. The message was short, just one line. "I drafted that contract. They told me to use the old template, but the signer's name was never checked. I don't want to be involved anymore." Roland traced the IP address and discovered the sender was a former employee of Bellamy and Sons, now living in another state. She had agreed to testify under the condition that her identity be protected. Eleanor looked at the file in her hand, then lifted her gaze to Martin. "Would you like to respond to this evidence?" Martin said nothing. His eyes briefly scanned his lawyers, who were now beginning to show signs of doubt. For the first time since the trial began, Eleanor saw a small crack in Martin Bellamy's arrogant facade. She nodded slightly. "The trial will continue tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the echo of the truth that had just been revealed still rumbled like thunder in everyone's heart. The courtroom was packed that day. The audience seats were completely full. Though no one said it out loud, everyone knew today would be the final day. The day Martin Bellamy, the man who once swaggered with his fame, fortune, and dark connections, would hear his sentence from the one he had once looked down upon. Judge Eleanor appeared right on time, wearing her familiar robe, her silver hair neatly pulled back. Her gaze revealed no emotion, but it was enough to silence the entire room, as if everyone collectively held their breath. "The court will proceed," she spoke in her deep, steady voice. After reviewing all the evidence, witness testimonies, and documents from both sides, the court has reached its final conclusion. Martin sat up straight. His face tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but the hand resting on his thigh was clenched so tightly it turned white. Eleanor paused for a moment, then continued. "Mr. Martin Bellamy has been proven to be the mastermind behind the forgery of documents, the coercion of illegal property transfers from citizens, and the unauthorized financial transactions routed through an intermediary company to evade legal responsibility." She looked directly at him. "This is not just a case of fraud. This is organized, systematic misconduct, exploiting the vulnerabilities of the elderly and the trust of the community. For these actions, you will be sentenced to 15 years in prison without parole and required to compensate all the damages to the victims." The room fell silent. A round of applause erupted from the back rows, then 2, 3, until the entire room was filled with sound. But Eleanor simply raised her hand and everyone immediately quieted down. She did not need applause. She needed the calm so that her final words could be heard. "The law is not perfect, but justice can still be served if we don't let go," she said. "I am just an old woman doing the job I was entrusted with. But I hope that from today, those who are being oppressed, whether because of age, circumstance, or power, will know that their voices matter." Martin was handcuffed. He glanced back one last time, but no one looked back. No more respectful gazes, no more whispered fears, only silence, the silence that the guilty must always face in the end. Eleanor stood up and left the bench. Outside, Mrs. Evelyn, one of the victims, was waiting, placing her hand on Eleanor's shoulder, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. Not just for the house, but for the faith." Eleanor smiled gently. "That's something we must never lose." In the distance, the first light of the afternoon sun shone through the courthouse windows, quiet and pure, like justice having touched the hearts of the people.
Miss Ellie's letter to my dear friend. Do you know, throughout more than 60 years of my life, I used to think justice was something grand. Courtrooms, towering buildings, eloquent lawyers, or dense legal judgments. But later I realized justice begins with the very small things. When we do not bow our heads in the face of wrong, no matter how powerful the person standing before us. When we speak the truth, even if our voices shake with fear. Eleanor's story is not a grand cinematic victory. It is the quiet triumph of an elderly woman who was overlooked but never let herself be subdued. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to bang her fists on the table. She simply walked to the bench, looked straight at the one who thought she would remain silent, and softly said, "I still have a voice." And the lesson for us, for you, for me, for anyone who has ever felt small, is when we dare to stand up, even if we stand alone, we are no longer alone. No matter how society changes, this remains true. Justice does not happen on its own. It needs someone to keep the flame. And sometimes that keeper of the flame is an old woman with silver hair, still holding a heart that will not accept injustice. So if there ever comes a day when you feel weak, when you feel you have no power, remember Mrs. Eleanor. And remember, we do not need power. We only need to believe that what is right still has value. With all my love, Miss Ellie.